Hello Hotwire is a free course geared toward building Ruby on Rails apps with Hotwire from the ground up. Visit hellohotwire.com to learn more.
Hold me close till I get up. Time is barely on our side.
This video is going to talk about getting started with ViewComponent, which is a framework for creating reusable, testable, and encapsulated view components. So it's built specifically for Ruby on Rails. It's kind of gotten popular from the GitHub sphere, so that I think that team actually put it together. One of their current design systems is based on ViewComponent, and I think their goal is to actually make everything an actual component. And the whole goal with this is to make your UI and your view renderings a little more modular, more user-friendly, as opposed to something like partials or helpers, which I kind of prefer personally, but I do appreciate what ViewComponent is, what it provides. And especially true for adding it to an existing Rails app. It's really not hard to do. You don't have to go full Ruby. You don't have to go anything else, like type of syntax that's just unique to the ecosphere. So you can kind of just like integrate it directly into your current ERB templates, which I think is compelling, as opposed to something where you have to reinvent the wheel. The main benefits, which I'll read off and then we'll get started here, is encapsulation. Logic is kind of scoped to that component. So everything from styling to markup, and honestly, you could even put your JavaScript scope to it if you wanted to. So everything's kind of containerized, which is nice, which that whole point lends another point towards testability. It's a lot easier to test those singular things as opposed to something like a full view test or something of that nature where you need to really make sure something's on a page. There's better performance than typical partials. It's built-in caching and whatnot going on with there. Extremely flexible, so you can add it to, like I said, you can add it to existing views and partials that you're already using. And they're pretty consistent as far as reusability. So you're able to build something really useful with something like Tailwind, for instance, and keep it scoped. And you're able to render a button that looks the same in every place. So I've fallen victim to this in the past where you just code a button with Tailwind or something, but then you need it on a completely different part of the app, and maybe the padding's off or the font sizes, etc. Kind of get kind of crazy. So making something unique makes sense to extract to some sort of component, and instead of doing it just on the CSS level, you could do it on the full markup level as well, which is the whole point of ViewComponent. Might be a little long of a tutorial just because I want to cover the real compelling parts of the framework, mostly so you're able to understand it and kind of kick things off maybe with a trial run on your own. So I'm going to create a new app, just call it ViewComponent Demo. I'm going to install Tailwind by default and then Bun for our bundling service. You can use Yarn, whatever else you want to use there. ESBuild, I mean. Yeah, so let's kick things off. This is the homepage, viewcomponent.org. There's a ton more here that I'm able to go through on this video, but I recommend checking that out, especially the guides when we get into something like slots. There's a lot here to know and be aware of, at least, so you're able to, use the full potential of ViewComponent in your apps. Luckily, there's built-in generators as well, so that'll save us a lot of time. Great, so I'll run the new app, kick it off, and we'll get going here in a second. All right, so I'll CD into ViewComponent Demo. Great, I'll open this in our code editor. We actually need a few gems to make this work, at least based on the demo I've provided. Of course, the one we definitely need is bundle add ViewComponent. I'm going to add a couple more to devise and then name of person. I'd use a template or something for this, but I want to just show you the whole process just to make it easier if you're following along. So let's first configure devise with ViewComponent installed. Now we have to consider a new directory for Tailwind, so maybe I'll do that quick. In here, we need to extend the Tailwind config to include what will be a components directory when we generate our first component. So say app components, and that's one we'll need is the html.erb, and then one that's going to be Ruby as well. So you need both of those. I think Tailwind offers a regex kind of thing where you can have both there if you want to enter those. I'm going to just do line by line to make it more obvious. Yeah, devise now. Let's do its install. We've got the gem installed. We just need to take care of the configuration. So we'll say Rails generate devise install. does its thing. The main, I guess, gist that you really need to pay attention to is like the default URL options and having a root action for your app. We will generate the views, so I'll do that quick. I want to change a bit of details on the forms. So Rails generate devise, and then we'll call user. Then we'll do that migration. I'm going fast here because this is all configuration. I could have done this before the video, but I chose not to because some people appreciate being thorough here. So we're going to add a first name and last name column to the user's database, and this is going to be for that name of person gem we installed. You need 2 columns to be able to use it properly, and it's just way easier once you do, so recommend it if you ever need it. It just allows you to reference a person's name in several ways, which makes things quite easy. We'll say Rails generate devise views. If I already didn't do that, I can't remember. I did. Okay. And then Rails db migrate finally. Awesome. A little cleanup action in the app before we kick the real ViewComponent stuff off is to add some data to our application controller. We're going to have a before action, and it's going to be configure permitted parameters if device controller. If you see autocomplete happen, I have a AI kind of installed here. I forget what it's called, Cody, and it uses I think, what model is it using right now? I'm not 100% sure. I just installed it, so it's kind of new to me, but it's using some AI to help with auto-completion or just ideas as far as you type. It's basically like GitHub Pilot, but free, protected, and we'll do that. Perimeter, we'll do sign-up keys, and then I've got name here, so that's already pretty much done. We'll need one that's going to be for account update as well. Great. So that's one thing to consider. On our user model, we should have everything for devise, but we need to have our updated name of person gem here. So here's our case for that. And this is all different stuff you can add. DHH made this. All right, let's update our users registrations files. These are going to need that name field now. So I'm going to just go in here and tweak this a tad. It's going to be a name. Make sure to change this field to just text field. And I'm going to get rid of the autofocus, autocomplete stuff for now. This won't look styled at all because I just want to save some time. Maybe I'll just swap these field classes for margin bottom with Tailwind, margin bottom 6, something of that nature. That gives us, a starting point basically. We'll do the same. I'm going to copy this and put it on the new. Not replace anything, but just add to it. We'll do the same real quick with the field thing. Great. And then I want to remove this stuff again. Awesome. So that's essentially it as far as getting that started. Let's go to our routes now. I'm going to update this to be posts. We need to run our posts generator still. I use posts a lot just for the example purposes, but it's just kind of easier to do for the sake of demoing. Real quick before I begin though, I want to update our layout to be a little more friendly on the eyes. So we'll say container mx auto px4 py12, just something plain Jane here to offset it from the edge of the browser once we fire that up. Real quick, I will also add some basic utility links for our app that delve with devise and also just making it easier to navigate around. We'll perfect this more as we get into the view component part, so this will become component, which I'll mention here. Just want to give you the links to start with. All right, not perfect, but it's a work in progress to give us something to go off here. I'll do a little offset here, this, and then maybe wrap those links in a nav. All right, before we go too far, let's model the posts part. We're we're going to do stuff revolving around a blog post. Maybe you would have an avatar, a blog post itself, or the navigation, what you just mentioned. So I'll go a little bit deeper here in a little while, but let's generate the scaffold of post, and it will be title, string, content, text, and then user references is important. So make sure you have that, assuming the user model is already in your app. Great. And I'll update our routes, make sure that's updated. I think I did that. Yeah. So now we have a post index, which will have the basis of the app ready to go. So let's see what we got. Boot up the app. Migration. All right. I got a little typo there, but other than that, it's working fine. Sign in goes to devise views. Tailwind pretty much strips everything from the styles, so it's going to look very ugly, but for the purpose of this demo, I'm not worried about it too much. We will tweak a few things as we go. On to the view component part. Let me close out some files here to clean things up. Currently, we just have the gem. We don't have a components directory, but once you do add your first component, there will be a new components directory in your app folder, and that will just essentially get auto-loaded and work out of the box based on the gem settings. So let's add our first component. It's going to be called a button component. So the way that looks in the generators you can run, if you want to see the generators, just Rails G, and then you can look up ViewComponent. They add it in the actual main Rails stack, so that's kind of nice. So let's do Rails generate component, and we'll call it button. It's going to have two attributes, label and href, I'm going to call it. You can call those whatever you want. It's just basically the things you're going to pass to the component that make it dynamic. So often a button will have some sort of link or a label attribute. We'll also have, I believe, a theme. So maybe I'll add that one too. Button. And I just do this for, my own sake, but you can lowercase this if you wanted to. So we'll run that. It creates a few files, first being the button component Ruby file. It's all in the components directory. It also creates a test, which is the whole point. I think a lot of people gravitate towards ViewComponent for testing. It's easier to do as far as that goes. And then also a template, which you can pass actual like ERB stuff through, rendering like instance variables and other things, methods from the component. So it's kind of a containerized take on like something like view helpers, which are kind of the same practice, but not necessarily the same way you'd go about creating a component. With a component, it's going to inherit initially from ViewComponent base. That's going to be just part of the main class namespace from the component library. What I actually want to do, and this is just preference, is to add a application component class. So I'll add that. You add it just to your components directory, and then it's going to contain some stuff we'll just need throughout each component typically. So I'll autocomplete that, and then include Rails application helpers. This gives us our URL helpers by default. I will also include the devise helpers for like user signed in, current user, all those kinds of things. And then you can declare helpers as a shorthand maybe. And we'll have action controller and base. Oops, there we go. So these just get included once you inherit from it. So in our case, I'll swap these out to application component, and that gives us the groundwork to lay as far as any kind of helpers we'll need access to. Okay, so an existing component, once it gets generated like this, we've got a clean slate. Essentially, you're able to pass these through to the initialize method and new instances of those up. Here you can pass defaults if you want to. If they're not and they look like this, it's going to require that actual attribute. In our case, I'm going to pass a nil for the label because there will come a time maybe when the button needs to be a blocked level component. So maybe you have an icon or something within the context of the button that's not just text, and you need to render a block to add that icon. This is kind of a way to do that. There's also an argument where you could just actually have the icon render within the component, or have an icon component within the button. It's all possible. It's mostly personal preference of how you want to go about the complexity of your components. I like to keep them quite simple. Craft up how our button theme will render. So I'm going to say case for theme. Based on whatever we pass, we can do certain things. So we'll say when primary It's going to be button primary. Pretty simple, right? And else we'll have a fallback just in case you don't pass a theme. You can also pass a theme by default, like I mentioned before. So we have one too many end statements there. Okay, with the button component created, let's go and focus on the template part. So included in each component generator is the template portion. It looks like your normal HTML partial, not a partial, but an HTML template where you can render actual code through. What I'll do actually here is just provide what actually is going to output when you render the component. So in our case, we're not going to do anything explicit. We want to pass all that stuff through. So we'll have our link property, or href I should say, and that's going to have a class, which we just pass that class name to. And we'll do a do block just to already render it as a block. And this is for the context of if you did render your component as a block, you're able to pass more to it instead of just text to render that stuff. Instead of label here, though, we're going to just render what's known as a contents. And for the view component, there's an actual whole guide about how this works. If you want to go to the getting started, there's an content assessor. I can't say that word. Where essentially, if you render the block like so, you can pass stuff to it without worrying about this. You do need to like make sure if, like in our case, we're going to have a label that will need to be like nilled out or just not have content to be able to render content in this place. So here you can see we've got these instance variables being passed to that component now. So we've got our href, we've got our label, and basically use the theme to do a case statement, which will render the appropriate button class based on what's passed. In our case, we're going to default to the primary for every button unless you tell us otherwise. So our case, the class name, essentially this method will take care of it thanks to this component. Let's go see what this looks like on our actual app. I'm going to go into, real quick before I forget, I'm going to go into our components, or our post controller, and add a line that will give us the setup for buys to work. So in our case, we need to merge our current user just like so. And before action, we'll want to authenticate user. Yeah, basically just what it did for me there. Index and show. It's fancy. So I'll come back to that in a second once we get into more of the component or a blog post component, but I want to make sure that was done. Real quick though, I'm sorry I'm jumping around. Before I forget, here I want to add some class components that just make up those buttons we made for the button component. So in our case, we're going to create those as new Tailwind components. This gives us just styles for each based on the outcome there. All right, so in our view is where I want to focus next so we can actually see what we've been putting together here. Here we've got our basic post demo. Everything's here. Add some text. There's some more stuff there, so great. Maybe I'll add some classes there. Give us some Tailwind stuff. What's happening? Let me restart server real quick. Oh, it looks like I have a typo in my styles. That's what's up. Let's double check that. Hope if I can spell. There we go. Great. Already working there. Let's do maybe 3XL. Cool. So we got this new post button. Well, what if we, used our new component for that? We could just say render. It's a lot like a partial. Instead, we're going to render a component since we call it ButtonComponent. We're going to new up an instance of it. And we'll have not text here. We'll have a label. And we also need to pass our href will be new post path. And then the theme will be, I'm assuming by default, will be our default color, but you need to actually pass explicitly if you want something else. Looks like I have an issue with mine. Real quick, let's go check it out. Class name, it should be button theme. My bad there. I have the wrong name here. It should be this. Great. So there's our component. It's rendering as a link, which is intentional. It's doing what we want here. Now, one cool thing, again, since we can pass that block, if you wanted to render maybe another button, we can do a theme. Just show something different here. Got a white button. Great. And one more maybe for grins that is a block. So instead of just rendering this one-liner, it can become a block. We'll get rid of the nil or the label in this case. And the content can then render as we want. So we could say get started creating a new post. There we go. So now we've got that. Our theme is here. Maybe we'll make this one secondary. And it looks like so. Not very good, but it's an idea of how you can theme this all and make it really performant. So just like that, you've got your component all set up. Next, we can maybe go a little deeper into the post stuff. One little gotcha that I'd like to explore, though, is getting into how you could potentially conditionally render this stuff. So there's a nice little built-in that's called render on components, and this is useful in the context of if you simply don't need to render it in some scenario, it should be the case. So maybe instead of user signed in, this isn't really a great one maybe, but they all won't render because I'm not actually signed in at this point. So that's kind of a nice little thing you can add if you wanted to entertain that. That'd be useful for like permission level things or an admin or something of that nature. Of course, you could do more conditional statements in your template should you need to, but that's just an approach you could take. Again, I would check out the documentation for the full suite of things you can add, but that just gives you a concept of what you could do with that. All right, let's take this a step further with a new component. I'm going to create one called BlogPostComponent. So let's get a new window here. I'm going to go and say Rails generate component blog post. And I'm going to pass just an instance of a post in this case. So we'll generate that one. It gets us our test and everything, which is great. And I'll go and create that component now. We can extract a few things, making it a little more performant as far as how it will accept attributes and whatnot. So by default, we're going to render a blog post component as a singular blog post. So with that in mind, you'd think you'd probably pass that post object through. So that's what we're going to do. In my case, I'm going to just like singularize things out. So it will get the title, and we could just say post.title and date, posts created at. You could do a shorthand this way, or I like to use the built-in formattings like so. And author, we'll say post.user.name, and if there's no name set, which we would have to ensure it would be set, but this is a use case where you could render a fallback, like an email in this case. And then I'll use a truncated excerpt for a typical blog post that you'd see, like say on an index path. So post.content.truncate 200, and then let's see, separator would be nothing in this case. Maybe a space. And I got a typo. Now you could pass maybe an option here that says truncate false by default, and then if truncated, you could render that in your view. I'll keep it as is. We could do it in the template, but you could do another like method that's just doing that conditional in line should you wanted to. But I'm calling this truncated content because the actual content keyword here is probably reserved. You don't want to really mess with that one in the span of a component, because that's part of the ViewComponent itself. It's like a built-in slot, I guess you could say. All right, let's go into the blog post component. We can hash this out. I'm going to add an article. Let me give it a class of P6 for some padding. Inside of it, we're going to add an H2, maybe just H1 tag. You can actually have H1 tags in your article tags. It's actually encouraged. So we'll say title, since we have that method now. And letting tight. Well, I'm gonna come back and make this better once we add another component, but I'm gonna just default to our text strings at this point, and then we'll say text base text, or that's kind of the same thing. Letting tight. Inside there will be the truncated content method we made, and then we'll also, the cool thing is you can render components in this component. So I'll say the button component new label read more. href is blog or post path. We could just pass post through since we have an instance of post. And then the theme, we could just say maybe white. Great. With any luck, we need to, of course, add a blog post first. So let's do that. Before I forget, I want to go and tweak that UI to not have the user ID, though. Not necessary since we're assigning it in the controller, if you recall. Let me do that again. Great. I'll create it. There it is on the front page. Currently, it's rendering what actually is our partial, if you notice that, because we aren't actually rendering our blog post. All right, so with the post iteration now, we can render this post component directly, and that should give us a starting point. Looks like I have maybe a typo. Let's go into our component. Yep, truncated. There we go. So now we've got this other post. I probably should have added more text. Let me do that real quick. Let's do lorem. Let me go into this page. I think I can do a, yeah, there we go. Update it real quick so it looks a little more like a blog post. Okay, cool. That gives us the groundwork laid. So now that component's rendering fully contained, it's got everything we want. Essentially, now we can extend it should we want to. And we're going to do that actually with an avatar component because I want to actually add something related to the John Doe. That gives us the ability to use components with the components and all that fun stuff. So let's create one more component here. Rails generate component avatar. It's going to be just past the user instance and a size. Avatar user size. Great. Okay, there it is. Let's go into our app. We've got that there. It's essentially quite simple to set up. We're going to do some basic stuff. You might want to extend this for the sake of being a real image that returns, of course, in your database. I'm just going to use like a placeholder that the AI gave me. But I'm going to define classes based on that size attribute we've got. So case size. Okay, then I'll have a private method. We'll have a default user URL. And I'll just add that username stuff back. Gives us this UI avatars API. It gives you just like the characters of the name that return. It's kind of nice. That's essentially our avatar component. Now we need to render it as like a HTML. So in our case, we're going to pass an image tag. We'll use that avatar URL method we made. Class will be avatar class, so we made that method. Alt will be user not name, and then title will be user.name. Fairly simple. Now back in our blog post component, we can continue on creating a little more polished look and feel for this. So I'll go back into that blog post component. Here we've got that. Instead of this by author thing, we'll do our render avatar component. And that's not going to actually be work. User. All right, in this case, we'll pass a small version back. I use the shorthand version of that. And then we can keep the by part. I'm going to use a div here. Margin bottom 6. And then this will just have a margin right of 2. It could be better here, but I'm just going to go with it. And then we'll have another div here. We'll just put author instead of by. Cool. So that gives us our little avatar component now. So you see it returns the initials of the first and last name. All right, I'll do margin bottom 6. Like my Jersey accent there. Margin. All right, for the truncated content, we're going to set a max width so it looks a little better. Of XL, 3XL. There we go. So something of that effect. Maybe the title links to the blog post. So there we go. So we could add maybe one more post. So as you can see, that's pretty componentized now. That makes it quite handy. We're able to use components within other components and then render that first component to make use of it in a really reusable and friendly way. So I really like it. Next up, I want to introduce you to what are known as slots. Now, there is tons of documentation on just slots alone on ViewComponent, and this is kind of, you can kind of think of it almost as part of a model construct, the way Ruby on Rails works when you do relationships. It has this syntax or naming convention called renders one or renders many, and it's just a way to decouple a component and render more of the constructs of what you want to iterate over within inside of it. Yeah, I would recommend reading the documentation to get the full spectrum, but what we're going to do is think of essentially revisit our navigation, and that's going to become a component. So what I'm going to do, instead of this big layout, I'm going to actually render a nav component here. So I'm going to do that now. Real quick, let's generate our series of components. It's going to be, I'm going to show you how to do it in a namespace way, just to save on organization and whatnot. I think it's pretty useful. You can also do this thing called sidecar, where it takes the template and makes a subfolder. Check out the docs. It's a little more involved, but I wanted to mention it. Generate component, and then we'll do nav container. So we'll do one big nav container component, then we'll just Rails generate component nav item. And it'll be a title. It'll have an active state and then also a href. And then finally a logo component. This will just basically be a way to render a logo in a quick one-liner. And we'll pass a path to that one. Oops. Should be component there. And that's not going to be in the namespace. We want that global. So here's our components library. Now we have this nav folder, and it's got those two we've added to it. The logo one is out here publicly, as I mentioned. Let's start with that one since it's pretty simple. I'm going to add a template that essentially is a link, and it's going to have a path. And then we'll add I'm going to go to hero icons and get an icon there just for something to use here, maybe a star. All right, so I'll pass a class to this just to give it some styles. We're going to make it very simple and say size 10. Stroke current, so it's already got the current color, and then we'll pass text blue of 500. Gives us this to go off of. The logo component, we don't even need to touch. This is already doing what we want it to. Just gives us a way to extract it to a component and render it in a unique way. And our container component is where the magic's going to happen here. We're going to use that renders one, and we're going to say logo. Here you can pass what component you're actually going to render. Call it logo in this case, but it's going to be logo component that actually renders in its place. And then we'll do a renders many, and you can call it links. I'm going to call it navs. And it's going to be an item. Actually, we could call it items. Something of that nature. Because it's nav items, etc. It's kind of an easier convention maybe to follow. And then in that actual file will be I guess the shell of the thing. So we'll say bg slate 50 P3, M3, rounded, medium, flex, item center, just to give it inline look. And then justify between. Inside of here, you can do this syntax where you can basically say if it exists, render it, otherwise skip it. So as simple as that. Since we've given it this name, our logo in this case, you can optionally pass it. Here we'll render the component of logo, which essentially is doing all the work for us. Based on this principle, it's going to pass that logo component. We'll do the same over here. I'm going to do a flex class. So we'll do items each, since we called it item, and then we will render the item like so. Right, so that gives us the groundwork to render our components in a such way that's very reusable. So going down into the item component, we have now our initializer with title active. I'm going to set false to default, and our href. Then we'll do just a couple methods to hook into the classes, which will be just a font medium and text base, and then we can render this active class method if it is active. So we'll say def active class and text blue 600 and then underline, and then this can all be based on if active. Then let's get that item component HTML. I'm in the wrong one here. This one should actually be in the container component. Oh, my bad. So I'll paste that back in there, and then the item component HTML should be just a simple link essentially. We'll do the href, make it a block by default. That way we can use that content slot should we need to. So title, present, and then we'll check for the title, else we'll render. Okay, at this point we should be able to render that nav now. Let's go into our layout. I'm going to rethink what we've got up here and re-render it all. So we're going to start first by rendering our container component as a block. So it will look like, in fact, we could just do nav container component, and it's going to have new instances of stuff. We don't need to necessarily do that since we're going to iterate over them. So in that case, we're going to still do the new, but we're going to do an iteration passing that component as an iterable through. That gives us the ability to do something like so, where you can say c.logo or with logo. This is just the convention here. And if there is a logo, you would render it this way. So say logo, then we'll render, since we have a property of path, we'll pass root path through to it. So we can see if that works. There it is right now, and it does have our link. Great. Now our actual items, we can go back through and say C with, for say the home page, we'll keep it at root path just for grins. There's our title, and we can also say active. We could say current page root path. So it's just basically passing a Boolean if that is indeed the case. Now we could say additionally if user signed in here, maybe do some logic and render different items. So item, here's our profile. Yeah, that's perfect actually. C with item, sign in. Man, AI though. Cool. So essentially that gives us the sign in and sign up links if we're not signed in. So that should give us the starting point. In the class items, we can go, I'm going to tweak the HTML here to have some gap, maybe something like that. And then this as well. Great. And instead of profile, maybe I'll say current username. You could say like familiar too. It gives us that shorthand thanks to that name and person Jim. Great. That gives us basically what we're after in that case. So we're essentially creating a componentized container component where we can render subcomponents, which in this case is a logo, or the item components that are going to be our nav links. That gives us the ability to do that all directly in line. I'm signed in, so there's no like sign out button, but that's essentially what you could do to make that work. I don't know that this would work with the sign out button. You would need to render or make your component a little more advanced for the sake of rendering a button instead of the link, because I know that for the sign out you need to render a button to element, and that's not necessarily what our template's including here. So you maybe need to do some conditional logic to make that the case. Also, like what kind of method it would need to post. It gets a little more advanced should you need something like that, but that's certainly up for grabs if you want to extend it. I'm going to leave that out for now for the sake of brevity, but that's just something to consider when you're looking at this. Next, I want to talk about testing and how you approach it with ViewComponent. Each time you generate a component, it's going to have a test directory with components there for its own similar test. Do one for the blog post component. It's going to be pretty simple. I'm going to use mini test for my stuff, so it might look a little different than what you're used to. So I'm going to do a def renders blog post details. Then we'll set that up. It'll be a do block, and it needs to be a test. To do this, we need some setup for our fixtures. So I'm going to do a setup block, and we'll just get post. Grab the first one. We don't have our fixtures really defined yet, so I'm going to go do that. That gives us the groundwork laid. Now we can set up our test to be a little more obvious. I can use something like Capybara for this. I'm going to use just the built-in inlining for our version of it, but you essentially just test what the component renders. If you want to do something else, you totally could. I'm just showing you by example here. So we'd assert text would be test post, and it needs to match our fixture, so that's the key. So John Doe, assert text. This, I'm going to go grab that. This is test post 1, assert text. We've got our created at stuff there, so saying this. Finally, assert link will be read more, which is our button. Now I'll use VS Code to run this in line just for the sake of being right here in this window. It did run. There's 5 assertions, didn't fail. So essentially that's it. Our blog post component is rendering as advertised. You maybe want to do more here if it has some different states or something like that. You could totally get away with that. The same applies to these other components should you want it to equal some scenario you're looking for. But that's essentially how you test. It comes stock with the app. Pretty useful stuff. So overall, my interpretation of ViewComponent is very positive. There are some best practices to follow, which are naming components based on what they render and not what they accept. So AvatarComponent instead of like a user component. So you wouldn't want to name it based on that object, essentially. In my pattern of creating components, I did create that application component. I think this is a good practice. You might want to go ahead and copy that. It just basically allows you to, define these things once. You don't have to include them all over the place, which is nice and very kind of Rails-like from the start. And then the generator is your best friend. I think just using that over and over is just going to save you so much time. And then you can use other syntax than ERB with ViewComponents, as such as Haml or Slim if you wanted to. Just basically what you can already do with Rails. But that's something to consider if you like more clean looking stuff than ERB. I don't mind ERB personally. A lot of people don't like it. That's totally fine. So with this, essentially you're able to create more modular components and fixtures and stuff with Rails, and that's very user friendly or developer friendly. So I see the appeal here. On my project of Rails UI, I see this being a continuation of where it heads. Right now I use pretty explicitly view partials and helpers, which are great, but they kind of are scattered around. So maybe an instance of Rails UI will feature some of this view component stuff as another alternative or another way to render the same components in the UI. So definitely see the appeal, especially when it comes to creating a design system, which is kind of the whole point of Rails UI. So stuff like that, I can see the appeal a great ton. I hope this video was helpful and let you see the ins and outs of ViewComponent. If you're on the fence, I'd really recommend like demoing it, checking it out, see what you think. Being a UI guy personally, it's definitely nice to see, and you're able to write quite a lot of cool contained code that you basically have to update once should you want to change it. It's like a button, for instance. Over and over, you would probably have to find this in your app if you didn't go and through and update classes or the presentation layer of it. So super cool stuff. That's it for now. I will see you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.